They came for the sound of her voice. It threaded out of Greyhook's fog like a bridge built from silk and memory, carried on the teeth-chattering wind across blasted streets and bruised water, stitching the broken city into a single listening. Mireia Quell sat in a gutted lighthouse where barnacles quilted the stones, the broadcast mic cobbled together from old ham radio coils and a theater's ghost lamp. She turned a page and read into the raw throat of the night, and thousands of dead heads tilted as one beyond the walls. Her private channel, Zombies Audiobooks, was what the living called it in uneasy joke. The dead didn't joke at all. They only leaned closer, mouths parted, as if the story itself were breath. Commander Orrin Haveth stood in the coastal command room 3 blocks inland, staring at the wavering green dot that pulsed for the lighthouse and at the colder blue arcs of the dirge towers. The sun-spoke array, a ring of weathered orbital mirrors, hung dark above the clouds, locked in bureaucratic stasis and a dozen broken failsafes. "We ride razor wire," he told his people. He meant the nightly balance, lure them, measure them, never quite strike the match. War for dominance. That was what the broadcasts boasted on skittish frequencies. Orrin heard the old boast and thought instead of his sister's hand slipping from his at the south breach, because the first time they used a story to draw the choir, he had pressed the trigger too late. Dr. Silpha K. didn't believe in chance. She believed in cadence and in the way certain vowels shook the infection awake in the skull and made the groan tilt into something like a word. She watched lines of data scratch themselves across glass. "The cadenza effect," she murmured, naming the ghost that had followed them since the first experiments. On a cracked whiteboard she scrawled Lazarus lullabies, the project no one would admit they were running. She had learned how to slice a narrative into frequencies that gripped the amygdala of the dead, had found that plot wasn't entertainment so much as a contagious order. Story as viral override. She did not say it aloud. Control. Casimir Voss crouched on a rooftop with a coil of stolen copper wire biting his shoulder and his rifle's barrel peeking at the boulevard below like a wary tongue. His breath fogged the scope. The undead moved in slow convulsions, an awful choreography punctuated by a ripple whenever Mireia's voice rose in wonder or faltered in fear. He listened for his own name where it would never be. What he heard instead were words from the book she was reading, The River That Forgot Its Name, spilling out of soft, blackened mouths. He thought of Ulla Fun and of how her last day had been a quiet one, scalp pressed to his collarbone as Mireia read about a river finding the ocean and all the longing in that simple thing. Something watched the watchers. Near the bottom of the stair in command, a woman in a weather-gray coat moved like dust had learned to breathe. Isolde Marrow kept her gaze lowered, fingers grazing the map pinned under a broken coffee mug. She had been a seamstress once, spines of pins like quills among her teeth. Now something else threaded her days. She had a transmitter small as a tin of peppermints, a habit of listening to empty channels where the dead seemed to whisper like tide-lapped wreckage. She tried not to hear herself in their sound. She had promised herself she would do what was necessary. Beyond the wall, the undead made music they didn't know was music. They hummed in sub-bass and in whistles, in intervals that made Dr. Cade's skin bead with cold that wasn't the room. The choir moved in patterns, swirls like schools of fish and eddies like weather. In one heat map there was a deeper knot, a cold star, the heart of their rumor. Silpha called it the chorus prime. It formed when the horde had enough bodies close enough to think together. It became easier to lure and harder after, because it began to choose, and whether a choice could be unchosen was an argument even Silpha didn't have the breath to start. "Tonight we run the long cadence," Orrin said. His voice was something you might not look at directly, like the brightest part of a flame. He tapped the table where the target zones shivered. "We need to see how far they'll come through the shipyards, and whether the eastern culverts are the choke we think." He didn't say don't slip, they all felt the slick edge. He didn't say, if the broadcast gets away from us, the Sunspoke will have to answer a question we've kept it from. Mireia would start the second act of the River novel at exact midnight. The dirge towers would yoke her words into thick braids of sound and run them like reins. Mireia pressed her palm to the cool of the microphone, as if the metal could know her, as if her voice could know itself. She wasn't sure, even after months in the lighthouse, whether she believed the dead were listening, or whether the living had told themselves something to make their fear beautiful. The truth was simpler: you cannot whisper into a city and not be heard by something. She read the next line and thought of the child who had sent a note folded into a paper boat, asking for dragons. She thought of the way Casimir's name had never once appeared on the scraps that found her. When she closed her eyes, she saw a sea, and a river that would not stop going toward it. On the street below, 100 mouths shaped a sentence they were not alive to know. "We will go to the sea," said the cadence through the choir, and the sound rolled against the wall in a low, patient surge. It wasn't the line Mireia had just read. It wasn't in the chapter yet. Dr. Cade stared at the spectrogram because the sentence had a form she had only seen in one place: human dream speech. "They're anticipating," Silpha said, and the word tasted like snowfall. Oren's hand hovered over a dead switch that would not bring the sun down even if he begged. "War for dominance," the radio hawk said. No, he thought, this was the world arguing with itself. And the dead had learned to make promises. Greyhook's morning didn't arrive so much as it exhaled, a pewter breath pushing between the skeletal towers and washing the lighthouse in a light that found every crack. Mireia's broadcast ticked off, an outro music that was just a vinyl record's gentle hiss. She laid her head on the desk, and the skin under her eyes glowed a thin lavender where sleeplessness lived. She had one note on the board, a child's hand printing, scrawled, "Please make the wolves be nice." The stubble of the city's hunger prickled the air. She poured water, sipped metal, and did not look at the lighthouse door where barrels and ropes and an old buoy pressed against the wind. Oren Haveth convened a briefing in a room where the roof had been repaired so many times it had learned not to complain. Maps hung like exhausted flags. "It's not just a lure," Dr. Silpha Cade said, tapping a pencil in rhythm so soft you could miss it unless your heart had decided to march. "They're predicting pattern. They're completing lines. Narrative closure is a compulsion for humans. The infection piggybacks on language. When a cadence begins, it fights to complete itself." She wanted to say more, about how those who were bitten often began speaking in fragments of story before they sank, about whether a mind refused to relinquish itself by telling itself one last tale. She drank the thought like poison and set the cup down empty. Casimir Voss stood near the back, the copper coil dumped by his boots, watching Oren in that quiet way the commander had that turned an order into a path. He scratched at an old scar and stared at the city's bones. "We need a resonance core," Oren said. The West Dirge towers low. They had 3 operational, 5 was a rumor from a time that drank electricity like rain. Museum of Intervals had a Chladni bed and a resonator in the acoustic wing. "If we want a long cadence run for the shipyard test, it'll take the extra push." He looked to Casimir almost without moving. "Bring it home." Nara Vey said, "Copy," before she could stop herself. She was too short for her rifle and too young for the wear in her knuckles. Quillen Puri rolled a cartridge between 2 fingers as if he could tell by its balance whether today would tilt for or against them. Once, he had mapped deserts by walking them until they told him where they began and ended. Tamsin Nettle had needles in a filament pouch, a braid wound like a noose around her crown, and a way of telling bleeding when it was still a possibility. The team would be small, the city smiled with too many teeth at anything larger. They moved out under cloud that looked bruised with thunder that would never arrive. The museum was on the south side, near the river that Greyhook had failed to remind itself was not a sewer until it had become one. They took the tunnels, where water dripped like clocks and rats mirrored their steps. A faded poster peeled from a wall, "The Ears of the City, an exhibition." Quillen's beam found a brass plaque half swallowed by algae, telling them that ancient philosophers had once believed the spheres sang. "Maybe they did," Nara said, and Casimir wanted to say, "Once, a human hand on a human face had been proof enough of the cosmos singing." At the base of the stair that led into the museum's belly, they heard the first syllables. Softly, as if someone had set a phonograph going 2 floors up. Mireya's voice? No. It was wrong by the thickness of breath. The dead towed the beam of Nara's light like insects tasting heat. A dozen faces turned and unturned in jittery unison, and one of them had the gentle slant of a librarian retired long before any of them had been born. He mouthed a phrase that wobbled, like a tightrope in a gust, and Tamsin's fingers were already at her belt. The rest of the horde was behind, in the grand hall, where sound would be a lake. They went quickly because otherwise they wouldn't go at all. Quillen took point, laid wire softly across threshold mouths and dragged a battered dolly from under a broken bench. The resonator was a plate of metal on a skeletal table, more art than apparatus now, every inch of it dust and the old perfume of vanished donors. Casimir lifted it with a grunt that made something catch in his shoulder, and Nara cursed under her breath in a language that had never learned mercy. The dead began to speak in answer, their own curse a wet sound. "We don't have long," Tamsin said, which was a form of prayer. They made it to the stair before the chorus prime flipped a switch none of them could see. It wasn't a noise. It was the sudden presence of a room full of sleeping things opening one eye. The horde moved together, the air clipping as if cut, mouths rounding the vowel in the word C like a ring to be passed from lip to lip. "Casimir," Quillen said, his first and last word of the day, because a hand like a cracked glove had fastened on his calf. He went down without flourish. Nara fired with such precision that for a moment the world looked neatly stapled in place. Tamsin had the tourniquet on before she knew she'd decided on amputation. "Hold," she said into Quillen's noise, and Casimir held, and the saw was a thing stolen from a boatyard where no one would ever sand cedar again. The cut took a minute that lasted 5 years. Quillen's eyes went to the green broken glass of a skylight where perhaps he could have watched birds once. "You map the way home," Casimir said, and Quillen's hand tried to trace in the air the route they were taking, because the mind loved a job. When it was done, they ran before the grief could catch them. Back in command, Dr. Cade watched the return blips crawl toward the lighthouse and swallowed a scalding joy. The resonance core was a lever. Oren looked at his palms, where a seam of old rope burn whitened the skin. "We still don't know who flagged our test to the choir," he said. They began speaking the second act before Mireya read it. He did not look at Isolde Marrow, who stood so that her shadow made a thin blade on the floor. "We won't discuss sabotage," he added, and meant certainly we will, but not here. In the lighthouse, Mireya strung cables with hands that had learned to be careful and calloused, and the light on her desk dimpled the glass like a shallow sea. She read to warm the room, she read because not reading made the world fall through her fingers. From the open window, far beyond walls and towers, the river's old path shone like a scar that had healed badly, too tight to let the skin rest. "We will go to the sea," she murmured, touching the words as if they were a sleeping animal. In the quiet after, something moved like a breath in the building. She thought it was wind until she heard the hinge whisper. Then the latch folded back. The figure at the lighthouse door did not announce itself, it simply existed, a crease where door met frame and then a shoulder, a cheek, a mouth that had made promises and broken none. Isolde Marrow stepped over the coiled ropes as if crossing a threshold into a life she hadn't been invited to, eyes finding the mic as if it were a candle that required wasting. "I want you to read something," she said, and the careful quiet of her words made Mireya think of seam ripping, of how threads shivered when released. Isolde didn't reach for the mic. She put a small book on the desk, the cover a piecemeal of salvaged leather, corners thumb-soft. Mireya recognized the script before the title, Dr. Silpha Cade's block letters. The Field of Glass Hours, Draft. It was the lure text she had refused, too neat in its manipulation, too tailored in its cadence. "No," Mireya said, more breath than sound. The book smelled of damp ink and something like limes. Down in her throat, the children who had written to her with lists of wishes, bananas, dragons, a father who wasn't afraid, squirmed like fish wanting out. "Who are you?" she asked, because it seemed rude to say why. In the very far away, the city hummed like a machine trying to remember what it had once done easily. Isolde, the woman said, and when she didn't append a surname, Mireia heard the choice in it. Isolde stared at the board with the scrawled messages. Her eyes softened minutely. You're the only one they listen to without turning, she said. They come close. They don't split the walls. They don't break themselves, not like with the towers. Tears wreak strange justice, they made everyone look like everyone else for a second. I want you to read an ending that isn't a trap. She touched the book but didn't open it, as if the pages were a mouth that could bite. Mireia did not ask how Isolde had come to the lighthouse without being seen, because some questions outed themselves as irrelevant. The clean ache of Quillen's absence was still a fresh bruise in the city. Casimir carried the weight like a brick in his ribcage. Oren paced in command, a storm cropped into a man's body. Dr. Cade stood with her forehead against a windowpane as if cooling something no one else could see. If I read that, Mireia said, nodding at the book, they'll move as you want them to. Isolde didn't blink. They'll move as they have wanted to for months, she answered. Someone keeps forcing their feet in circles. Under the museum's broken ribs, Casimir Voss knelt and washed the blade he had used on Quillen, rubbing oil into the metal with cloth that once had been a floral scarf. Nara Vey sat with her rifle emptied, cleaning the fear out of it with method. Tamsin Nettle took out a small paper-wrapped bundle from her bag and set it on the table, a cigarette each, rolled from leaves someone had grown in a room with a skylight like a patient that had almost recovered. We can't keep sawing pieces off each other to make a city, Tamsin murmured. Casimir thought of Ulla again, and then he made himself think of the sea. In command, Dr. Silpha Cade finally spoke the thing sticking in her mouth. They're tracing the shape, she said, to Oren, to anyone listening, to the unkind windows. Every night we give them a story. Every day they stagger through the echo of it, the neural pattern trying to complete. If we end with a cliff, they gather at the cliff's idea. If the ending is a funeral, they circle the cemetery with a patience that looks like worship. She lifted her eyes. If you give them a sea, perhaps they will go into it. Oren's jaw worked. The sunspoke array waited above like an unmade decision. Or perhaps they'll learn to swim, he said. It was not entirely a joke. Isolde's fingers toyed with the hem of her coat. There was a time when a human voice over a loudspeaker meant food, or help, or at least a home you could leave in the morning, she said to Mireia. The first time the soldiers used voices to call them, it was to kill them more efficiently. She did not say, my mother left stitching in the machine, she went out when they called, she came home burning with the story like it was fever, and then they pulled her back with new sentences and fire. She made it a simpler thing, I'm done with us making the dead choose us to end them. Mireia touched the book's spine. The letters, S.K., were flame-small and stubborn. Do you think they want rest, she asked, or a reason? Isolde blinked slowly. Which one do you think we're owed? In the wall, the lighthouse groaned like a shy animal. Mireia looked past Isolde's shoulder at the slough where the river kissed the harbor, at the gulls like scraps of paper and the way the sea's skin tightened when wind ran its nail across it. She heard Oren's unspooled voice on the comm, we have the core, we run tonight, and Dr. Cade's thinner tone, it must be this way, and Casimir's silence, the shape of a man holding more than he could carry. When Isolde left, by the same route she had entered, by which Mireia understood the guards' unions were failing at the hinges, Mireia turned on the mic and read anyway, not the lure text, not the field of glass, not the hour slipping like a blade. She read a page from the river that forgot its name where the current remembered a fish and changed its mind about how to move. She watched the sound levels bloom like soft venom. Below, the first of the dead tilted its head, and a gull's cry braided in. In a place she couldn't know, a knot of the choir tightened. In another, it loosened. In Oren's ear, a pattern slid a click to the left. Everyone who was awake felt it with their blood. At sunset, the resonance core hummed like an organ warming up. The dirge towers took Mireia's words and bent them through the city's broken ribs, feeding the cadences through alleys and upstairs and across water. The plan: draw the mass to the shipyards, trap them in the grid of cranes and wreckage, and if need be, risk the sunspoke. If it fired true and if the clouds parted and if the old satellites remembered how to obey, Greyhook could scour a swath clean. War for dominance looked less like charging and more like measuring which levers still moved. In command, Oren gave the nod. In the lighthouse, Mireia began to read. In a narrow path between piers, Isolde Marrow set a tiny transmitter on a bollard and flicked it on. The choir turned their faces toward the promise of a story. The grid of cranes at Greyhook's shipyards rose like the bones of enormous birds, ribs and wings and beaks paused mid-swipe. The tide made the rust whisper. Mireia's voice grew long and low, a loom pulling weft through warp, lengthening a pattern until even those who no longer dreamt could feel its shape. The dirge towers swelled the sound until the air itself seemed to carry weight. Oren Haveth watched the horde shift on the monitors, the map changing color like a bruise healing badly. Tamsin Nettle had her kit ready and her hands warmed, breath scuffing the window as she watched Nara Vey zero her scope. Casimir Voss leaned against a forklift corpse and listened to the moan of 50 windholes the cranes had turned into, each singing in a slightly different key. "We make our own weather," he said. Nara glanced at him without breaking discipline. "And then we curse it," she replied. They were both right, they were human, and rightness was a scarf too short to cover both throat and chest. Dr. Silpha Cade leaned into her console. "You'll hear a phrase in 6 minutes," she said to Mireia over the comm, "a cadence that pretends it came from you, but it won't. Don't repeat it." She left unsaid the why, repeating would confirm it as authorial voice. It would make the choir more obedient to the chorus prime. Mireia nodded against the mic, though the scientist could not see. The old words became new weapons, and sometimes a wound. The phrase came early. "Lay the boats in the water," the choir said in breath-threaded unison, and Mireia almost choked. It wasn't in her book. It wasn't in her throat. The words threw a rope around Oren's memories and pulled him backward hard. A boat braided from reeds, a foolish joke, his sister holding the knot as if it was a bird. He forced himself forward. "Proceed," he said, voice stripped. Dr. Cade's jaw tightened. This was the chorus prime speaking with its mouth full of stolen vowels. It was offering instruction. The sabotage arrived inside the sound. A whisper, faint as lace, slid under Mireia's voice like a current under wave. Not a jam. Not a crackle. A second story, burrowed. In the towers, the narrow-gauge amplifiers hummed, and some of them changed frequency by a hair. "What am I hearing?" asked Oren, though he didn't have time. "An insertion," Silpha said flatly. "Someone is threading a supplemental cadence." She was impressed despite herself. It was delicate work. It was also monstrous. Isolde Marrow crouched behind a catwalk girder by the eastern pier and listened to the green light on her pocket transmitter blink. Her breath slowed. She had written the inserted line herself with Silpha's methods and her own heart, knowing exactly how to slip between threads. On the water, punts and skiffs jostled, roped to rotting cleats like horses tied to a post in a town that had lost its cowboy language. "They're moving," Nara muttered. The horde bled into the shipyard in a sideways ooze, drawn by Mireia, nudged by the whisper. The dirge towers pulsed like lungs. Casimir thought of that night on a rooftop when Ulla had lifted a hand to touch a cold star. He felt something unfreeze in him and become dangerous. "We do it now," said Oren. A wolf metal in his voice, and over the lake of static the sunspoke's request ping shot through the clouds. It took too long. The sky didn't owe them speed. The mirrors turned with the stiffness of old men rising from pews. Dr. Cade watched the sensor dish reach for the coordinates she had marked in her nightmares. A hush bloomed that wasn't silence so much as every sound taking a breath. And then the clouds thickened monstrously, a shrug of vapor like a shoulder lifting to block. "No shot," said Tamsin grimly. Oren's knuckles went snow-white against the console. The sunspoke relay blinked helplessly. The window was closing, and with it, the thin, ugly hope of a clean sweep. In the grid of cranes, the choir stopped moving. It was the strangest thing. The shuffling ceased, the wobble steadied, the living saw all that absence of motion and realized how used they had become to the sound of bone on asphalt. The phrase came again, "Lay the boats in the water." Mireia did not repeat it. She did not gasp as Silpha knew she wanted to. She said instead, "The river remembers the way." It wasn't about command, it was about telling a truth the dead could survive. The whisper under her voice threaded its alternative, "We are listening." Isolde Marrow watched, confused at how much it hurt. She had wanted to pry control from the hands that would roast bodies by the hundreds if it would purchase another week. She had wanted to give the dead a choice that wasn't a weapon. But as the choir tilted toward the glint of the sea, as they rearranged themselves into a listen rather than a collision, she felt a hollowness open like a trapdoor. She saw her mother's hands on a table, stitching darts into a dress that would never be worn. "We are listening," the whisper said again, and Isolde understood that a listener is responsible for the voice they choose to swallow. A shot cracked. Nara cursed, it had not been hers. Half a block away, a squad of the gutter line, a faction more militia than community, more anger than plan, had decided the plan was theirs to break. Bullets bit metal. The sound of them complicated the song. The choir flinched at the high snaps and began to fold inward. The prime was close, the prime loved convergence. "Hold your fire." Oren shouted into a channel already fractured. It was like shouting at rain. In the last 6 months Oren had faced down starvation and riot and hope coming too late. He had never felt smaller than he did now, yelling at human stubbornness. The dirge towers faltered, one of them spat a curl of smoke like an old dog coughing. Mireia's voice wavered and held. Dr. Cade's hands scuttled over controls to reroute load. "We can still do this," she told the room, tone like a taut string that might twang or snap. Casimir laid his palm on the resonator as if it were a living thing. The sunspoke's window puffed closed like a candle pinched. "We can still do this," Casimir repeated, as if the words had mass. He thought of boats. He thought of rising tide. He thought of what he could carry and what he could not. Casimir Voss found Isolde Marrow by the eastern pier because he had spent a life finding the source of wrong winds. She looked up from the transmitter, eyes bare. The world around them loosened and tightened like a wrist with a too small bracelet. "That's yours?" he asked, not accusing yet. The transmitter blinked as if embarrassed. Isolde swallowed. "I won't let them use her voice to herd us to slaughter," she said, and it wasn't bravado. There was a grief in it that pushed its way to being a principle by the sheer fact of not being allowed to be grief in public. He thought of the certain violence, the way Oren's face would become a blade and Dr. Cade's mouth would draw thin. He thought of Mireia, whose voice had become the city's last polite secret. "What are you offering instead of slaughter?" he asked. "A walk?" Isolde's gaze slid toward the water. "Yes," she said simply. "A walk to the sea." He almost laughed, but the sound stuck. The zombie nearest them tilted its head as if it could hear an argument in flavors. In command, Tamsin Nettle wrapped a dressing around her own forearm where shrapnel had taught her a new scar. Nara waited for a target like a prayer that might be answered with no. Dr. Cade worked, every movement guilty and sure. Oren wanted to break the console for not being an enemy he could put down with his hands. He turned instead to the empty space where his sister would have been, the space he carried because it reminded him not to ask others to risk what he asked himself. "Someone's got a whisper in the line," he said. "Find me the mouth." Silpha was already triangulating. The mathematics were cold joy, they savaged their sums cleanly. She breathed out a name. Oren tasted it and said nothing for 2 seconds that felt like theft. Mireia felt the shift long before the monitors noted it. The choir, halted mid-motion in the metal forest of cranes, began to turn by degrees, bodies swiveling as a flock's might when an old instinct twitched. They faced the harbor mouth, the slot where river met sea. The phrase threaded under hers. Lay the boats in the water. She could have cancelled the broadcast, yanked the voice from the air and left the city to its natural, unadorned terrors. She did not. Instead, she changed the story she had been reading's ending. She read as if she had always meant to. When the river found the sea, she said, it did not surrender. It stood, tall as a cliff, and taught the sea its name. On the spectrogram, Dr. Cade saw a pattern curl like a hand unclenching. Casimir put his hand on Isolt's wrist and felt the wiry strength. Come with me, he said. You're going to explain it. She didn't step back. I will if they don't shoot me first. She knew the thinness of the line she walked. He thought her brave. He thought her foolish. He thought perhaps those were the same thing when the world had burnt too many dictionaries. He marched her toward the crane grid, toward Oren, toward the place where choices would make themselves felt like weather. The choir parted around them with a slowness that was not human and not inhuman, just the pace of things that had decided. Oren saw them cross the main rail. He half raised his gun and forced his arms to remember he was not a puppet. That's her, he asked no one, everyone. Dr. Cade didn't look up, too many dials were slipping into red for her to take her eyes off the bench. That's Isolt Marrow, Nara said quietly. She sewed my winter jacket from a sail. She did not add, she took oranges from the ration line twice and no one called her on it. Tamsin said, if you're going to shoot, let me move the med kit. Oren's laugh was a terrible bird escaping his mouth. He lowered the gun. Isolde held out the transmitter with 2 fingers. This is mine, she said, as if handing a vase to a museum guard. It's the size of a book because it should be. I said, we are listening. I'll say it again. Oren's restraint cost him invisible blood. Why? He asked. He would have preferred a target he could despise. Isolt's face did not change. Because when you taught them to come to a voice, you taught them to be told what to do by whoever took the voice away from its owner. I am giving them a choice. Keep your son spoke for war. Use my words to end a story. Dr. Cade made a small, helpless sound. She had written the lure text because she had wanted control, because control had meant her dead might mean less. What story? Oren asked, because he wanted it to be a lie that tasted sweet and left lead in his mouth. About the sea, Isolde said. About rest. She turned the transmitter over like a worry stone. The first time I realized I could speak and they would turn toward the river, I went home and burned my fingers on nothing, because there'd been no fire for weeks and I needed to be sure pain was still honest. She did not mention her mother's dress. She did not need to, it hung between them anyway, bodiless and beautiful and ruined. Mireia took a breath that she saved for later. Isolde, she said into the mic to the woman who was now a shape on the dock, a name in Oren's mouth. What would you like me to read? For a second too quick for the heart, everyone in the radius of Greyhook who could hear the broadcast was suspended like a drop of water held by the lip of a leaf. Isolde turned her face toward the lighthouse as if the word might have weight enough to feel. Her mouth made a shape around a memory. Read them an ending, she said, in which the world doesn't ask them to become a weapon to be lost. Something enormous moved in the horde. It was not a limb. It was consent. The bodies arranged themselves into axes, the prime, that cold star at center, warmed minutely as if humility had brushed against it. Dr. Cade saw the spectrogram fletch in a way that meant tears if one were human. She pressed heels into eyes until sparkles danced. They are ready, she said. Oren Haveth felt the cord of action pull against every muscle he owned. He had been a soldier before he became this was not soldier's work. This was attending a birth and choosing not to count. A small boy named Eldrick Knave, whose ears had learned early to collect scraps of sense from the wind, sat on the roof of a bus 1 block north, legs turned into a question mark by shoddy nutrition. He listened to the phrase, "We are listening," any way a child listens to a command from the air. He began to hum the last tune his father had whistled before the infection learned their family name. Down at the water, the first of the punts rocked gently. Nobody had put it there. It had been tied to the world by a knot so old the rope looked like a vein, and it had waited because some things do. They came in lines, like an army that had finally remembered drill, except their discipline was a patient kind. The choir moved toward the water without tangling, shoulders brushing, fingers trailing along rust and rope in each other's sleeves as if the last thing their bodies remembered was courtesy. Narave watched them with the cold eye with which she watched everything she loved. "If this is a miracle," she said to Tamsin, "it's one I don't know how to keep." Tamsin's mouth was a hard line, but her eyes, their edges pinked by smoke and salt, softened when Eldrick's hum skated past like a flat stone touching water, touching again. Mireia read. She took the river she had been telling and let it decide on a new form. The river, she said, did not have to be only a path. It could be a mirror. It could be a mouth. It could name what it loved as it went. Some names sank, some rose like skimmed foam. It kept going. She kept her voice low, a subterranean tremor more than a flag waved. The dirge towers carried it, skinned of sharps, into alleys and across rust decks and through the metal bones of cranes. Dr. Cade monitored a resonance that felt like the city's thyroid deciding to regulate at last. Isolde stood beside Casimir with the transmitter in her palm, ready to cut her signal if it pulled too hard. "We are listening," her whisper told the air like an invitation. Under it, an instruction, quiet as prayer, "When the story ends, turn away." She would be blamed for this, she would be praised, she would be both, in the manner of anyone who made a decision when others had not known how. She thought of her mother's face making that shaved pale smile and of the day she had realized that if she stopped telling herself her mother would come back, she could cry. On the water, a kind of geometry wrote itself in hulls and bodies. Punts and skiffs and dinghies began to fill with the undead, not cramming, not crushing, but settling as if sitting down in church before a hymn. The phrase came again from the choir, soft now, "Lay the boats in the water," and the people who had learned to be afraid of sound relearned the difference between a command and a wish. Oren stood tall on the dock and did nothing. He let every muscle that wanted to act be overridden by the hard choice to witness. The gutter line made their move when the second boat left the splintered ladder, because patience is a rare art and an angry man's enemy. The first shotgun blast punched a hole in a skiff's nose and sent 3 bodies tumbling into the slick. The water around them inched red, then blacker. The prime snapped like a dog jerked by its chain. All at once the turn toward the sea threatened to become a tear. Narave didn't think, she acted. Her first shot took the shotgunner's hat off without finding head, her second made a wind out of a wrist. The crowd behind the gutter line scattered, but the damage had been done. The choir reeled. Casimir knew this moment in his bones, it was the second before the wrong spread into everything. He moved. He and Oren and Tamsin threw themselves into the gap where the line of undead bent, bodies against bodies that did not feel. "Listen," he shouted, not sure to whom. "Listen." Eldrick's hum, high and thin, found a new note and then another, and it wasn't song, not really, except perhaps everything was a song, a plan, a step, a life. Isolde raised the transmitter to her mouth until it nearly touched the lip she had bitten. "We are listening," she said deliberately, and under it, "When the story ends, turn away." Mireia read the end she had not known she knew. "The river," she said, voice so steady it felt like architecture, "kissed the sea, and the sea kissed back." They were not the same. They did not pretend. The tide came in, the river went out, they met in the middle and bowed. When it was time, the river turned back and taught the children its name. She breathed properly for the first time in days. She didn't believe in spells. She believed in listening. She believed in endings that gave a shape you could walk out of. The dirge towers flared and faltered and recaught as if flame had tongue for enough. Dr. Cade held them from failing with 3 fingers and a memory of what sunlight had felt like on her face when she had been small. In that moment she allowed herself to love the thing she was doing, manipulation and all, because sometimes survival grew flowers from the compost of deceit. She thought, too, of assault, and of the nice word for sabotage, revision. She would apologize if they all lived. The boats moved out, slow, purposeful. The undead held their bodies like borrowed coats about to be folded and given back. Those who could not fit on wood waited. The tide had come up, by miracle or the way of things, no one could say, and at knee-height the water seemed to soften bone. The first of the row of listeners reached the sandbar where the river's mouth widened and the undertow pulled. Those left on shore watched with hands doing anything they could find to do, nodding, patting, fussing with useless cords. Orrin Haveth, who had almost been a different man, allowed his face to lose its armor by an inch. And then the chorus prime changed its mind, or perhaps it remembered it had one. A tremor ran through the body field of the undead that had not yet boarded. They stopped, as a single being might stop when a bird strikes a window and falls. They turned their faces, not toward the sea, but toward the lighthouse, as if a word had to be spoken before they left. Mireille's voice went soft, like cloth run through hands. "Go," she said, "because writing a story is nothing without letting it go. Go. Go." For a heartbeat, the city held its breath with her. Then the front line of the boats crossed the mouth, lips against lips, and slid into the greater water. It should have ended cleanly, like the slide of a knot, like a kick of oar. Instead the night decided it was a creature with claws. A gust opened its hands and battered the harbor, and the punts bobbed like toys. One snapped and spilled. Bodies went under and did not return, and those on the shore who loved to make the dead monstrous felt pretty as they watched because grief sometimes dresses itself. Orrin Haveth lifted his chin and found Dr. Cade's eyes. "If I give the order," he said, and she knew the rest, for the sun spoke, for the blaze, for the decision they had refused as long as possible. She squeezed a corner of the console where a sticker of a cat had peeled. "They're almost through," she said. "Trust the ending." Nara Vey murmured curses to steady the shaking in her wrists. Tamsin Nettle gathered a small stack of the living's injuries and kept them from leaking out of their bodies to go find the sea earlier than planned. Casimir Voss took Eldrick Knave's small hand because the boy had slipped to stand at his knee without asking permission, as if permission were a thing anyone still had to give. Casimir said, not knowing if it would matter, knowing he wanted to hear something with intention that was not a gun. Isolde Marrow stood at the edge of the dock with the transmitter pressed to her heart. She could feel its weak ticking. She remembered, suddenly and with great force, the way her mother had rinsed her hands in a chipped bowl after long work, pink threads like veins in the water. "We are listening," she said into the mic one last time, and this time the words were apology and blessing both, a benediction for the living as well as the dead. She turned off the device. She put it in Casimir's hand. "When they're through, destroy it," she said. He nodded because he had already intended to. The chorus prime stood at the hinge. You could not see it, you could feel it in the way a body knows another in a dark room. Dr. Cade's spectrogram showed a pattern that made no math, shapes that mapped onto no familiar frequencies. She thought, not for the first time, we are not the only engineers here. She picked up the mic that never spoke to the world. "If you can hear me," she said into the quiet of her own throat, "my name is Silpha, and I am sorry for the things I have done to your song." No one else heard her. Beyond the wall of her chest, the chorus prime moved, and she did not know toward which verb. Orrin's voice came to Mireille through the bones of buildings. "Finish it," he said, and she took that and made it gentler. The river, she read, watched the sea and did not change its name. It did not vanish. It did not abate. It kept its stories. The sea kept hers. When they were tired, both rested, and the animals came and drank and were not afraid. She closed the book that wasn't hers. She folded her hands together and thought of every child who had asked for dragons and received instead a working pump or a hot stone to put in the bed. Her throat ached like someone had wrapped a ribbon tight around it and knotted it behind her neck. A second wave of the undead reached the boats. This time the loading was smoother, the geometry less hesitant. The prime's tremor steadied. A shape of sound like a bridge cast itself across the water. Then came the moment that would belong to tales later, when attempts at telling this day would plant their flags, because someone always must stand out to anchor memory. Isolde Marrow stepped onto a plank, and then onto a boat, and the boat took her weight. Her mouth had closed around a name she did not say. The dead in the vessel did not turn to her. They made a space as if a coat on a hook had slipped and they had caught it without thought. Casimir moved to stop her. Oren put a hand on his sleeve that was not command but kin. "Let her," he said. It was not his authority to grant, it was his to withdraw restraint. Tamsin looked down and busied herself with gauze she did not need. Nara lifted her rifle and then lowered it. Eldric's hum crept up a scale and sat there like a bird on a wire. Isolde did not look back. She placed the transmitter on the plank at her feet like an abandoned ring. The boat slid forward, and the sea, which owed no one kindness, lifted it delicately. The sun-spoke array answered Oren's window with a blink. The clouds had opened a coin's width. "You could call it," Dr. Cade said. "You could call the fire and you would be history's man." He looked at her, at the green and red freckles of data that made his city into something legible. He saw, shaking across the pier, the gutter lines slinking away, shame in the bend of their shoulders or only weather-bent. He saw Mirea's lighthouse, white scar on grey face. He saw the boats like a string of beads. He saw the river's mouth. He pressed the calm, "Stand down," he said, and the words hurt like he was ripping off a scab too early. The boats made it past the bar. The last of them scraped, a body fell, another hand took it, they righted. The first ones reached deeper water, where the undertow smoothed into something like belonging. The undead did not thrash. They sat like people who had been told to sit. The sound in Dr. Cade's graph settled into a low field with peaks like heartbeat. The prime's point dimmed, not gone, only less declared. Mireia read the last sentence she would read that night. The river, she said, returned to its work, and the sea did hers, and both were, and that was the end. In the pause after, the city was so quiet that the wind's conversation with an upturned soda can down the block took on narrative meaning. Oren Haveth unclenched his jaw one notch. Nara's scope found no further war. Tamsin let her shoulders drop. Casimir lifted the transmitter and looked at it as if seeing a snake whose venom had saved a life as often as it had taken one. Eldric Nave stopped humming and breathed like a person who had run and survived. Dr. Cade pressed her palms flat on the console and pressed her forehead to her hands. Mireia covered the mic. "Good night," she told the empty room. "Good night." Morning came as a rumor, which is how hope prefers to arrive. In Greyhook, gulls stitched ragged patterns in a sky that had spent its anger. The lighthouse smelled, just a breath, of orange peel someone had rubbed along the windowsill long ago, back when the world wrote itself with less lead in the ink. Mireia Quell slept for an hour slumped in a chair, woke with her neck telling her it was mortal, and walked to the window. The harbor held fewer bodies than it had at dawn. The living's boats bobbed empty, the dead's boats, out beyond the mouth, looked like punctuation, a string of ellipses where there should have been a period. Dr. Silpha Cade printed graphs as if paper still mattered like it used to. She touched a line that had gone flat. They listened, she said, awe drilling holes in the scarred wall around her conviction. Oren Haveth stood beside her with his hands in his pockets because he didn't know what else not to do with them. "We don't know why they didn't turn around," he said, voicing the fear that had gnawed his edges. "We don't know if they will." She nodded. "We rarely know why," she said. "We proceed on hope and hypothesis. The only thing I can promise is that this pattern looks like rest." That word made him sway. Casimir Voss walked the dock in slow passes, looking for the bit of wood that had been, for an hour, Isolde Marrow's horizon. He found nothing. He closed his fingers around the transmitter she had asked him to destroy. He set it on a bollard. He lifted his rifle butt. Then he stopped. He thought of the risk of tools falling into wrong hands. He thought of the risk of never again hearing something he might need. He thought of the river. He looked up and met the gaze of Eldrick Knave, who had found him without asking. Sometimes, Casimir said, surprising himself with the softness in his voice, we give back what doesn't belong to us. He lifted the transmitter and let the sea take it. It bobbed, made of stubborn things, and then, as if remembering it had a role to play, it sank. Narave cleaned her rifle and then put it in a locker, not a holster. She touched the jacket Isolde had made for her, running a finger over the seam where sail became sleeve. Tamsin Nettle wrote a note and pinned it to the wall in the medroom. If we try to fix everything, we will die, let us fix what is in the room. The note crooked. She left it crooked. She walked out into the day and saw a girl teaching her brother to tie a knot with a piece of electric cord. She stood and watched until the knot held. Then she cried with her hands in her pockets and her mouth quiet. In command, Oren Haveth moved the cat sticker on the console back into alignment, and it felt like tenderness done with a knife because he didn't have other tools. We have to talk about the gutter line, he told the room. Not today. He touched the radio and, after a long half-minute, spoke on the citywide that had once read weather and shipping and now read prayer requests and names of the lost. If you can hear me, he said, voice low, that was a first step. There will be more. We do not know what happens when a story ends. We are learning to end them with kindness. Hold the walls. Share your water. Sleep if you can. Mireia returned to the mic that had become her confidant and her accuser. She ran a thumb along a dent in its grill and said, Greyhook, good morning. Today, we're going to read something that used to make me laugh. We've earned a laugh. She reached for a battered book of essays collected from a world that had been so sure it was ending itself that it had forgotten how to live. She turned to a page where a woman named The Difficulty of Pie. She smiled, little as a scar. She began to read. Across the city, bodies that had remained, either by choice or bad luck, tilted toward her voice and did not move. They listened, as the living did. Dr. Cade found Oren later on the roof under a scrubbed blue pocket of sky. He looked smaller up there, the air was bigger. You could have burned them, she said, not accusing, a scientist noting a variable. He nodded, eyes on the mouth of the river where it frothed like an animal dreaming. I could have, he answered. And then what would I have been? She didn't say, still the man your sister loved. She put a hand on the wrestling fence and let the metal sing to her. We'll have to prepare for the ones who come back, she said. We'll have to choose again. He sighed. Of course, he said. That's the work. Casimir brought Mireia an orange. He set it on her desk and watched her look at it like a relic that might still bless. You didn't have to, she said. I never have to, he answered, which was as close as he came to thank yous in daylight. I saw Isolde go, he added. Mireia's fingers tightened on the book's spine. I saw her, too, she said. When I finished the last sentence, I thought maybe I heard her breathing. They stood in the small room with the big view and gave the silence the weight it deserved. Then she asked, What will you do? He shrugged a little and said, Go to the shore. Count boats. At dusk, Eldrick Knave sat on the bus roof and watched the horizon for the ellipses. Fewer dots now. He liked that, it looked like an ending, not emptiness. He hummed and decided never to tell anyone what tune it was, so it could belong to anyone listening. He thought of the wolves in the paper boat note, and of dragons, and of how maybe the world had given them both but changed their names so as not to frighten them. He slid off the roof and found the knot the girl had taught her brother, it held. He smiled and put his hands up to catch the cold. Night returned with less teeth. The city found places to set down its sharp things. A rumor drifted in on the wind. People downriver had seen figures in the surf, walking, then walking less, then not walking at all. The sea had been as kind as it had been asked. On the docks, Oren stood with Nara and Tamsin and Casimir, and a space where Isolde would have been if the world balanced its ledgers. They looked out. Dr. Cade appeared at his shoulder and did not speak. Mireille's voice lifted from the lighthouse and spoke of pies and peas and the way laughter makes air warmer. Grey Hook did not fix itself. The gutter line would be dealt with or would multiply, because people do. The sun spoke would rust further or someone would coax a light from it. The towers would crack and be patched. Books would be read to keep the dead moving or resting or listening. The choir would build new primes or break its own habit. In a town 2 days north, someone would try to weaponize what Grey Hook had done, and someone else would try to make it kinder. The world would argue with itself again, louder here, softer there. War for dominance would be a phrase people used when they wanted the comfort of certainty. At the harbor mouth, the river kept its appointment. It met the sea. It returned. It held. In the water, far enough out that even the keenest eye could mistake, something moved like a hand lifted, then lowered. Eldrick would swear later he had seen someone wave. He would not tell who. He would only hum the tune and say, they went where the story said they could go. And in the lighthouse, Mireille, finishing a paragraph about pies and patience, paused and listened to the hush between her words and the old stone walls. In it, she imagined a breath. Whether it was wind or gratitude or the seething nothing that follows a good ending, she could not say. She spoke anyway. "Good night," she said again. And this time, across water and wall and mouth and ear, something that was not the living and not the dead answered back, as softly as tide over stones.